Welcome, everyone, to the Week 12 Stardom Situm Preview Podcast. My name is Joe Arpasi, otherwise known on the internet as Purple Rain. I began doing CFF analysis work in 2008, and you can find me and my work at letpurplerain.com. Today is the first Let Purple Rain podcast, and I'm delighted that all of you are here to come join me for this maiden voyage. You will find more podcast coverage over the course of 2025, and I'm really looking forward to what is heading your way. In this Start Situm preview, you will find my honorable mention selections for this week's slate of games. Premium subscribers at letpurplerain.com will have access to the full podcast show where I review an additional 14 players and answer your fan-submitted questions. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial and see everything that our premium subscribers have access to. You can find a link to this week's Stardom Situm article in the description of this video as well. Now that we've covered that, let's get into some college fantasy football. Let's get things kicked off here with Braden Shager from Hawaii. Over the last 3 weeks, he's averaging 31.2 fantasy points per game. What I love is that the Hawaii passing game is actually starting to improve. They're now ranked number 42 in fantasy points scored, and Vegas is calling on Hawaii to be able to score 30 points. One big reason why they're doing this is that they're facing Utah State. Utah State's defense is not very good at all. When it comes to giving up fantasy points in the air, they're ranked 127th. When it comes to giving up fantasy points on the ground, they're ranked 133rd. I'm including the ground production there because Shager's actually been getting some decent production on the ground. And as you kind of go through and look at some of these other stats that we have with their defense, the thing that I really like the most, anytime that I can find a team that's given up 2 or more passing touchdowns a game, I look for that as a very favorable matchup, which you have here. And then anything where you're getting 60, 65% or higher for red zone touchdowns allowed is pretty good. Shager's got both those going for him here. And the other things that I like is the last time he faced opponents that are pretty similar to this, he was averaging 28 and 25 fantasy points per game. You know, it's very possible he could hit 30 for the first time this year, which I think will be pretty good for him. And when it comes to sitting a player, I'm going to go with Blake Horvath from Navy. He's actually been down right now. For the last 3 weeks, he's only averaging 16.1 fantasy points per game. I'm going with rushing stats here because this is Navy and they're running the triple option. But Navy is number 4 in the country for rushing fantasy points scored. Tulane is just a tough defense. They're not ranked better than Navy when it comes to stopping fantasy points on the ground, being ranked number 22 in fantasy points allowed, but they're only giving up just over 1 rushing touchdown a game. You're only going to get a red zone touchdown about 45% of the time. And any defense that's holding offenses under 30% conversion rates on third down is pretty tough. So Navy, I think, is going to have a harder time sustaining drives, working their way down the field. Unless they hit some big plays, it's going to be difficult for them to just keep grinding their way down the field with someone who's so good on third down. There's not a lot of similar matchups for Horvath that we have for this type of matchup with Tulane, but looking at about the closest thing we can find, it's not the best comparison, guys. I'm going to be honest with you here, but Notre Dame. Notre Dame ranks 10th in rushing fantasy points allowed, and in that game, Horvath only scored 17.3 points. Just not really an ideal time to be playing him here, so best leave him on the bench. As we move over to running back, I'm recommending that you start Amari Daniels, Texas A&M. This is a pretty simple and straightforward one, guys. Basically, he is now the lead running back due to multiple injuries in this Texas A&M backfield. I feel bad for all of the guys that have been hurt for the season, but now Daniels is getting this chance to step up and be the running back one. Really not even trying to talk about what he's done over the last 3 weeks. This is going to be a brand new situation for him where he's going to be getting a workload share of carries. Vegas is calling on Texas A&M to score 47.5 points against New Mexico State. New Mexico State is awful. When it comes to rushing fantasy points allowed, they're ranked 127th. Yards per carry allowed, 5.02 yards. Rushing touchdowns allowed per game, 2.67. And then red zone touchdowns allowed, 60%. Third down conversion rate, 43%. All of these things are fantastic stats for anyone that you're looking at, let alone you get a power 4 team versus a group of 5 team. So everything is lined up perfectly here for Daniels. And there's not a great comparison that we can give you for a similar matchup, mainly because Daniels hasn't had that many carries. But the best thing that we do have here was with McNeese State. I just have them, I call them 150 because they're FCS. But with limited carries, he scored 19 and a half points against McNeese State early in the year. So this could be a huge one for him. I mean, I think he's got potential to hit 25 or 30. For sitting, I'm going to go with Delbert Mims. He's been on a slump lately. He has been a little dinged up. He's only averaging 9.75 fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks. And Eastern Michigan, they have been getting good running production, despite the fact that they're only ranked 71st in rushing fantasy points scored. They've just kind of hit a rough patch. And Vegas doesn't even think that they're going to hit 20 points, that they're only going to score 19 and a half. Ohio, they're pretty tough, and they're not a stellar defense, but when it comes to the MAC, they're one of the standout defenses. For rushing fantasy points allowed, they rank 35th. I don't want to go up against that when you've got such a mismatch of Eastern ranking 71st right now for rushing fantasy points scored. Red zone touchdowns is not bad, but the rushing touchdowns just about under 1.25 per game. There's just not going to be a lot of scoring opportunities for Mims here. And, with them only allowing 3.46 yards per carry, I doubt he's going to hit 100 yards. And this, I don't think it's going to be as bad as the matchup that he had with Toledo, but Toledo ranked 35 in rushing fantasy points allowed. So pretty comparable there with rankings to Ohio. And Mims only scored 1.8 fantasy points. I don't see him being that bad, guys, but still, this is just one. If you're trying to find those spot start guys, I know it's the playoffs, but if you're trying to find them, Mims just is not the guy this week. Wide receiver, this is a situation where I've got a guy I love. He's still available in most leagues, so he's a great waiver wire guy. And frankly, I think he should be picked up if you are in a keeper league, a dynasty league. This is a guy who could be great come next year as well. Makai Lemon at USC. Over the last 3 weeks, he's averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game. And he is still available in most leagues. You're not finding too many wide receivers who are out there averaging over 20 points a game right at this point in the season. USC's pass offense for fantasy points scored ranks number 20. Vegas is expecting them to come in just under 30 points against Nebraska. Now, Nebraska's defense, about middle of the pack when it comes to pass defense. So they're number 69 in fantasy points allowed. They're giving up just under 2 passing touchdowns per game, and red zone touchdowns allowed, though, is good. So they're giving up red zone touchdowns 62.5% of the time. Third down conversions, not too good at about 36%. What I like about this is that you don't need to find a defense who's completely terrible, who's ranked in the 80s, 90s, or over 100 to be a good matchup here. They're about middle of the pack at 69. Look at a similar performance that Makai Lemon had against Rutgers. Rutgers ranked 75th in passing fantasy points allowed. Lemon put up 23.4 fantasy points in that one. I think this is kind of for some people, this is going to fly under the radar, but I love this matchup for this week. Lemon's a definite start player for you. Sit. And for anyone that's been following Cincinnati, this will not be much of a surprise. Xavier Henderson. And right now, you could even say the entire Cincinnati passing game. This group has been struggling here for several weeks. Henderson himself, over the last 3 weeks, he's only averaging 8.45 fantasy points per game. And what's been really rough is they've had some good matchups that you see on paper and you say, okay, they should finally break out of the slump, and they're just still not doing it. So I look at some of these things where Cincinnati's still ranked 30th in passing fantasy points scored. They're facing Iowa State. And any of you guys that have been reading my articles throughout the season, you've seen if I see Iowa State's passing defense is coming up against somebody, I say sit them. Just don't do it. It's not very good at all for you. They're ranked 4th in fantasy points allowed in the passing game. They're giving up just 1 passing touchdown per game. The one thing, if there's anything to exploit, it's the red zone. It's tough to get down there on Iowa State, but if you do get down there, they're giving up just over 68% of the time touchdowns to the other team. Anything over 60, 65 is good. But I think the difficult thing is just going to be for Cincinnati. Can they even get down in the red zone to exploit that? And if they can, are they going to be able to throw it? Can they run? I think just right now, this whole Cincinnati offense is rough. I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And there's really no good comparable defense that Henderson has faced for being this tough with their rankings. So, I mean, I had to pull up a middle of the road team. Colorado, where they're ranked 67th in passing fantasy points allowed, and he only put up 2.1 fantasy points that game. I'm just, once again, going to say it. Whether it's Henderson or anyone else in the Cincinnati passing game, just sit them as your safe bet. At tight end, I like Taylor Thompson this week from James Madison. He's been doing pretty good, but not great the last 3 weeks with 11.3 fantasy points. He's finding the end zone, but not getting much yardage. And that's kind of been the one thing that if he can just get a little more yardage, I think he's really going to have a breakthrough game. This one with Old Dominion, I think, has a setup where he can do that. With Old Dominion, they're ranked 97th in passing fantasy points allowed. They're giving up 1.78 passing touchdowns a game. And to give you, I looked up 2 games that are pretty similar for matchups. Georgia State is ranked 80th in fantasy points allowed, and Coastal Carolina is ranked 92nd. In both those games, you had Thompson putting up 13.2 and 15.8 fantasy points. This Vegas line of 28.5 points, I think it's kind of tough, but if there's a guy that you're going to kind of count on that maybe has a good shot of getting a higher percentage of the touchdowns from James Madison, I would say Thompson's probably the guy to do it. The guy to avoid this week is going to be Thomas Fidone from Nebraska. He has not been playing bad lately, and actually he's been catching my eye as a guy who's slowly getting better as the season's gone on. But over the last 3 weeks, he's only averaging about 7.5 fantasy points. The Nebraska passing game hasn't been great. I'm not too worried about where they rank. I'm more focused on the fact that Vegas is calling for them to only score 21 points. This USC defense, middle of the pack, ranked 63rd in fantasy points allowed. They're not giving up a full touchdown a game. They're at 0.89. That's going to be tough for Nebraska. And the red zone touchdown rate, which really where you want to see for your tight ends. There's not too many tight ends that are going to break big, long runs. So you're hoping for defenses that are going to give up high touchdowns down in the red zone. USC is not exactly doing it here, 56.2%. It's not terrible, but I'm going to be looking for 60% and above in that area when I'm looking at tight ends. And you've got 2 pretty good comparable matchups with Fidone's past here. With Rutgers, they're ranked 75th in fantasy points allowed. He only scored 4.5 points. Colorado, they're ranked 67th in fantasy points allowed. He only scored 2.3 fantasy points. This is one that I want to kind of caution everyone. Like I said, Fidone's been catching my eye. He's been getting better. I think he can be a decent player as we move forward and definitely into next year. But just for this week, he's going to be down, and don't let that discourage you from continuing to look at him once this week is done. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on today's preview show. If you want to access the additional 14 player selections and fan-submitted questions that can be found in the full Stardom Situm episode, sign up for a 7-day free trial at letpurplerain.com and have full access to everything my site has to offer. You can also find a link to this week's Stardom Situm article in the description of this video. Starting on 12/5, I will begin covering the 2024 CFF Top Gun Challenge. This is a competition between some of the very best CFF websites on the internet. And at the end of this competition, we'll find out who is the best of the best at preseason player projections. This year's Top Gun class consists of Campus to Canton, Let Purple Rain, RotoWire, and the CFF site. LetPurpleRain.com is the exclusive home for the Top Gun Challenge. I want to thank each and every one of you guys that takes the time to read my articles, to watch these videos. Your support is what makes it possible for me to keep doing this work. I just want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that you have a great day.